Thanks, Michael. It's not. Today, I mean, when you're talking about medical cannabis, it's a huge topic, and each hour could be taken up by each single condition. But the big issue in today's society, I mean, we have a huge range of illnesses that we have to cope with and are generally treated very poorly, but the rising star is cancer. Right? There's cancers now overtaking heart disease and vascular disease as a leading cause of death amongst the population. And in my experience, I mean, my medical experience, which started in the 1970s, is that the disease itself is becoming more severe. By that I mean it's occurring in younger age groups, it's occurring at a younger stage of the evolution of the disease, and it's much more aggressive. Like in what I call the old days, the happy old days, it was still a lethal disease, but it behaved a little more sort of predictably and a little slower as well. Now, typically, in the old days, cancer was treated with surgery as a first option. And we're lucky in this country to have a fairly well-regulated and more or less ethical surgical service. So we really should be very thankful for that. Modern medicine has got a lot to offer in terms of relief of suffering and all the rest, and a lot of that, the benefit of modern medicine, is via its surgery. Unfortunately, where medicine's gone off the track has more recently with the pharmaceuticals. There's been what I consider a deliberate attempt by pharmaceutical companies, firstly through their agri-businesses, to cause illness, and then to offer solutions based on their expensive products. Now, I put that thesis to someone recently, I think it was a mechanic who was servicing my car, and he says, "You mean the government's really trying to hurt us? I don't believe that." I said, "Well, you've got to pull your head out from under that pillow and actually take a look at what's going on." There's a lot of examples where the government is actually trying to hurt you. Now, it's very difficult to know whether we're dealing with bad people or simply mad and stupid people. And my solution to that is it appears to be two different factors. There's the stupid people doing things without really thinking about what they're doing, but there does seem to be a group of people, the shadowy corporate leaders, or whatever you want to call them, don't call them the Illuminati, I'll just call them the shadowy corporate leaders, seem to be pushing humanity into areas of ill health despite the science. Now, what I want to do, as I said, mostly concentrating on cancer this time because there's a lot of misconceptions about the disease and there's not an overall approach to how it is. So it's something you can conceptualise and then take steps to deal with it. The problem is at the moment, the allopathic doctors, and if you're familiar with that term, an allopathic doctor is someone who merely treats a symptom of a disease, so responds every time there's a new symptom. Antihistamines, antibiotics, anti-anxiety, they're the anti-doctors basically. But they seem to take the view that cancer is just something that randomly strikes, that's got nothing to do with your lifestyle or got nothing to do with what's happening out in the society, but it randomly strikes you, and the only thing you can do is go for early screening, even though the screening is more or less discredited across a range of different conditions, and then have their chemotherapy, and then they'll give you 6 months to live, and then you'll go to palliative care and die. That seems to be the natural history of cancer in their estimation. What I've observed myself is there's been a change in the way they approach cancer, and it's a really serious issue, because if you're, say for instance, diagnosed with a bowel cancer in the early stages, it's generally a simple matter to do what they call an anterior resection, take out that part of the bowel, join them up, hopefully change your diet, and you should go on to lead a more or less normal life. Unfortunately now a lot of the oncology doctors have pushed their way in front of the surgical doctors and offering chemotherapy with the rationale that it will shrink the tumour and make the surgery easier to do. Now, I was shocked when I saw this because my attitude is if someone's coming to surgery, they really should be in the strongest and best possible condition before they face the surgery. Otherwise, it's just a series of steps downwards. But what they're tending to do now is give chemotherapy and sometimes even radiation and then have the operation. My experience over the last few years is that that's often a total disaster, because the recurrences that we often saw in 2 or 3 years, if they were going to recur, are now happening in 4 to 6 months. And it's really bizarre how aggressive the disease can become once it's irritated. Now, what's the theory of cancer? And this is something that's seriously missing from the way they're talking out there. You know, they're spending, I don't know what proportion of our health bill is on chemotherapy drugs and radiation, but it's a huge proportion. Worldwide, it amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars. It's just an unbelievable industry of massive decreasing returns. So as the cost of the cancer drugs go on, now they're getting more and more barefaced about what they can actually do. And you're allowed to sell a cancer drug that costs $80,000 on the basis, say pancreatic cancer, if dad or mum doesn't have it, they'll be dead in 4 months, but if they have it, they'll be dead in 7 months. Right? In practical terms, in a life of 70 years, those few months, often spent in an intensive care unit in a hospital or on IV antibiotics because of your neutropenia and your infections, they're hardly worthwhile. But the way the TGA operates, if the doctors can demonstrate, and this is not, I'm not playing with the figures, if they can demonstrate, I think it's a 20% reduction in the size of a tumour that's sustained for 28 days, 1 month, 1 lunar month, they can call that a successful drug. Right? Just let that sink in for a minute. What difference does it make to a person if you get a 20% reduction in the tumour? Now, the trouble is, there's a massive amount of dishonesty in our biology, in our understanding of the biology of cancer. Now, I was guilty of this because when I was sort of taught, I suppose you could say, or indoctrinated, there was just a glossing over of what cancer is. But now that we understand its biology a lot more, okay, we're getting in early for Christmas. Well done, mate, well done. It's a nice looking story. Okay. Now, when you actually look at cancer more seriously, what you see is it's not just one cell that's grown up. The biology of cancer is much, much more complicated than that. Now, the first thing is, we were taught, I suppose, for want of a better word, and I spent a lot of time studying pathology, so I've studied a lot of cancers under the microscope. And the thing that really strikes you in terms of the abnormality seems to be the changes in the nucleus. Now, if you remember back to biology and things like that, a cell is basically a cell membrane. Within that cell membrane is a nuclear membrane with the DNA in it, and then around that is a cytoplasm. When you look at a cancer cell, the nuclear DNA appears very abnormal. The nucleus itself is often much larger than it should be. It's irregular in shape. It obviously looks abnormal, and it seems reasonable to think that the cancer problem starts in the nucleus. And all the research money over the last 15, 20 years has been spent on cancer genomes and things like that. That's when they use these massively sophisticated machines to sequence the DNA. That means to look at the order of the base pairs of the DNA in the hope of finding something about cancer that's uniform and can be used to actually attack it. Now, unfortunately, even though we're sort of $50 billion down the track on this cancer genome project, what they've actually achieved is zero. Right? Zero in terms of scientific understanding. What they've achieved is a massive relocation of funds from the paying public to corporations. That's basically what it amounts to. But in terms of scientific progress, the understanding of cancer by the allopathic medicine, by the allopathic model, that's by the model that says it's all a nuclear issue, has achieved nothing. And when you take a really hard look at the cancer survival statistics, things haven't really changed since the 60s in terms of longevity. There's about 4 or 5 particular types of cancer that do spectacularly well on chemotherapy. Things like testicular cancer, choriocarcinoma, the pregnancy cancer, these things, and sometimes Hodgkin's lymphoma, do spectacularly well, and they have a 90% 10-year survival rate. And the chemo doctors have used those four relatively uncommon cancers to hang their hat on and see how good chemotherapy is. But when you look at it against the big common cancers like the breast and the bowel and the prostate, what you're finding is that modern methods of treatment, we've actually gone over the hill of benefit, and especially in the case of gastrointestinal tumours, the bowel tumours, if you have chemotherapy, your longevity is actually less than if you don't have chemotherapy. Now, the doctors always, I've seen so many patients that have fronted the oncologist, and he'll say something like this: "Oh, madam, you've got such and such a cancer," or "Sir, you've got this, and if you don't have chemo, you'll be dead in 6 weeks, but if you have chemo, you'll go 12 or 18 months. And I asked them to ask that oncologist, how can you make that estimation? When was the last time you actually gave a cancer patient none of your weed-killing poisons to see what the natural history of the disease is? They simply don't know what the natural history of the disease is. And what we've been doing over the last 30 or 40 years is actually weakening the person's immunity. The trouble with the doctors, they see the cancer as this enemy that has to be attacked. No, it's a bit like America attacking Iran. Forget about collateral damage. Forget about anything like that. Just bomb them back into the Stone Age with their cytotoxic drugs and things like that, without accepting that cancer is an interrelationship between a disease and a person. And if you don't take that into consideration, you really can't be successful. You can't practice veterinary medicine on people. The neuropsychological connection is extremely strong. And in many ways, the effects, the beneficial effects you can get from mental strategies is as high or higher than what you get from the chemotherapeutic drugs. Now, I just want to come back to what I was saying about the cancer shrinking 20%. Remember, a drug company, if they demonstrate just a 20% shrinkage for a month, they can call that a successful drug. Now, what happens when you look at cancer under the microscope? You don't see one cell type. It's not a clone of cells. It's normally what you call polyclonal. There's many different clones within the cancer. And what's more than that, it's a really dynamic process. It's not like you've got something and the cancer that you had 2 years ago that was first cut out of the breast or wherever it was, when it comes back into your bones or lung or something like that, it's not the same cancer. Right? Cancer is a series of downward steps as the thing becomes more and more what they call undifferentiated. So it ceases to actually appear like the tissue that it came from, and then it ends up like what we call undifferentiated cancer, which is normally untreatable and very rapidly lethal. Now, like I said earlier, the thinking is that it's all got to do with genes, but this must fail as a theory, because we're seeing an epidemic of cancer. If it's got something to do with genes, you don't see a change within one generation. Right? The doctors then will backtrack and say, oh yeah, but it's a susceptibility that they had for the cancer. So there's lots of ways you can play with words. The issue is that the genes aren't the driver of cancers. Even though they've found many things called oncogenes, and an oncogene is a human gene that when it's aberrantly expressed can cause cancer, things like P53. We've got all these things called tumour suppressor genes. The biology of our bodies is unbelievably complicated and unbelievably sophisticated. So we actually have cancer protective genes in our body which suppress the growth of abnormal cells and help the immune system to recognise them. But it doesn't answer the question of what's actually causing cancer. It's really important because it touches really strongly on the therapy for cancer. Now, I bet a lot of people in this room have heard the name Otto Warburg. Is that correct? Otto Warburg. Otto was one of these genius chemists back in the 20s and 30s, and he made a very thorough and unbiased study of cancer. Back in the days when the scientists weren't working for drug companies, they were working for knowledge and they were working for human health. That was a really happy time before the corporate takeover of where research goes. Anyway, what Warburg studied, and I just have to add one more little detail to the cell that I was talking about. Remember I said there was a cell membrane, there's a nucleus in there, and then all the thing in the middle is called the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm are full of these little organelles called mitochondria. You might have seen little diagrams of them. The mitochondria are basically the energy factories, the energy factories of the cell. And what they do, they take the glucose from the food we eat and they metabolise it into energy molecules. They're called ATP. It's not important what they're called, adenine triphosphate, but they're the currency of energy that the body uses. So I'll just go through it again. The body takes in glucose, it's absorbed through the gastrointestinal system, it gets into the cells, and then the mitochondria, these little energy factories, metabolise it and produce energy molecules, the ATPs. And the ATPs are what the body uses to run itself, right? To build up proteins, to create hormones. Any process in the body needs energy, and all the energy comes from ATP. Now, what Otto Warburg discovered, and very, very elegantly demonstrated too, is that the first lesion that you see in cancer, so when you look at really early cancers, the nucleus looks more or less normal, but the first thing that's missing is the quality and quantity of mitochondria. So he actually studied, there's about 1,000 mitochondria in each cell, and the bloody assiduous bastard got out there with his microscope and counted them. And what he found, basically, that early in the cancer process, the lesion appears to be in the cytoplasm, not in the nucleus, and it appears to involve the mitochondria, in that there's a smaller number of mitochondria, and the ones that are there don't look quite normal, right? So it appears that he created what they call the metabolic theory of cancer, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, because I do think it has therapeutic efficacy. Now, more than that, then he went on to study the actual biochemistry. So after looking at the anatomy of the cell, then he started studying the biochemistry. And what he found was the first lesion that was detectable in cancer, by a lesion I mean the movement away from normality. So the normal process is you get one molecule of glucose, you metabolise it, and you get 28 ATP per glucose molecule. That's what you call aerobic, or with oxygen, aerobic glycolysis. Glycolysis means you break down glucose in the presence of oxygen. So the terms are easy to follow. Aerobic glycolysis, right? 28 ATPs from each glucose. But when you study cancer, they've lost the ability to use oxygen in their metabolism. And they've reverted to a primitive form of metabolism called fermentation. And even if oxygen is present, the cancer cells can't use the oxygen. Instead, they use anaerobic, or without oxygen metabolism. And with each glucose molecule, they're only able to produce 2 ATPs. So remember, 28 ATPs from a healthy cell and only 2 from a cancer cell. Now, it's interesting that Otto Warburg's research directly led to the creation of PET scanning. Right? PET scanning stands for positron emission tomography. And what it is basically, it's an enormously complicated technical process, but in principle, it's fairly straightforward. And what it involves doing, you get a radioactively labelled glucose molecule and inject it into the patient. Because the cancer cells are so inefficient at using glucose to metabolise into energy, they take up a lot more glucose. They call it glucose avidity. It's very avid, or it sucks up the glucose because it needs something like 14 times more just to get the same amount of energy. So to have a PET scan, say for instance mum or dad or anyone has been diagnosed, say, with a lung cancer, and then the doctors, before they consider an operation, want to see if it's spread throughout the body, they give you this radio-labelled glucose, leave it for a number of hours, and the cancer cells differentially accumulate the glucose. They suck it up at a much, much higher rate, and then you put someone under a gamma camera and you can see just where the glucose-avid metastases are. It's quite an elegant process at looking at the whole body and getting an idea of where the cancer is and how active it is. And it's all based on the work of Otto Warburg. But even though they're exploiting his work to produce these diagnostic instruments, they're ignoring his work as to what actual cancer is and how to deal with it. Now, they did a really, really elegant experiment, because the doctors are still saying whatever Warburg says, it doesn't matter. The cancer's in the genes and it all starts in the DNA. That's their mantra at the moment. But if you get little microdissection kits and you get a cancer cell and you take the nucleus out of the cancer cell and put it in a normal cell, it doesn't go cancerous. But if you get a normal cell's nucleus and you take out the cancer cell nucleus and put the normal nucleus in the cancer cell, by rights, by their theory, the cancer should stop. But the cytoplasm transmits the cancer tendency. So cancer, when you look at it that way, is a metabolic disease caused. The first problem is the inability of those tumours to handle glucose, in a very similar way to diabetes type 2. By diabetes type 2, people become insensitive to insulin, so you can't absorb the glucose into your body and you end up with high levels of glucose. It's a metabolic disease, and it can be cured, like type 2 diabetes can be cured by metabolic therapy. In the same way, Warburg argued that cancer is a metabolic and not a genetic disease, and the approach should be a metabolic approach. It's the next few years will actually sort out who was right on this, but my bet's on Otto at this stage. Now, what does that mean? Everyone goes through the mantra of, we know that cancer, sugar feeds cancer, right? And in a sense it's right. It's a simple statement, but in a sense it's right. I mean, cancer is like all the cells in the body. You need energy for them to function. There's no doubt about that. But there's one lucky metabolic difference between cancer cells and ordinary, normal cells that can be exploited therapeutically, and this has given us some hope. It's this. Ketone bodies are chemical molecules that are formed from fat, generally during periods of starvation. So if you stop all oral intake of glucose or food of any sort, after a while the glycogen in your liver is depleted in a day or two, and then the body starts manufacturing these ketone bodies. Now luckily the human body can run fairly well on ketone bodies, and even though the brain prefers glucose, in extremis the brain can run on ketone bodies as well. Luckily, the cancer can't. Whatever lesion caused the problem with the mitochondria and caused its loss of ability to actually use oxygen to metabolize glucose properly. So it's a bit like having a furnace. Instead of it burning really well with the oxygen pumping through and you're getting lots of heat, you're getting this sort of black smouldering sort of metabolism that you have to throw a lot more fuel into to get the same heat output. The cancer cells can't actually use ketone bodies, right? So the idea of induced ketosis, and ketosis simply means a state where you starve the body sufficiently to produce a lot of ketone bodies. So your body can run fairly well on it, but the cancer is now under fairly severe metabolic stress. That means it's got no energy because it can only run on the glucose, and it simply won't have enough metabolic drive to multiply and spread. Okay? It's a simple theory, but it's one that's been borne out in practice. There's a mountain of work, and most people don't like this thing. There's a mountain of work that indicate that calorie restriction is strongly associated with longevity and freedom from disease. Right? Sorry, it's bad news, but it's the way it is. The less you eat, basically to a point, the longer you live. And they've done this time and time again with different animal work and things like that. And the effect isn't subtle. It's not like you get 10% longer life or something like that, or reduction in tumours. The effect is quite dramatic. Right? And it's given rise to a whole lot of intermittent fasting regimes and things like this. Now, when you actually try and approach the issue of metabolic treatment of cancer, you run up against the fact that no matter how few calories a person's eating, they still need all the nutrition that comes with it. And it's very hard to actually have a calorie-restricted diet and get all the nutrients you need, just because the foods are often not that nutrient dense. Luckily, since we've discovered the nutritional benefit of hemp seed, it's allowed us to create a ketogenic diet that is still replete in nutrients. And that's a real issue, because the doctors, the allopathic doctors in the hospitals, have been using ketogenic diets for many, many years to control childhood epilepsy. And it's quite often quite effective in controlling intractable childhood epilepsy. But my experience when I started taking on these patients 2 or 3 years ago was that after they've had about 2 years on the doctor's ketogenic diet, they end up with such severe nutritional deficiencies that it negates the whole thing. I've seen like a 9-year-old boy with osteoporosis so severe that his bones were breaking simply lying in bed. For the last 2 years, we put him on our version of the diet, and that has improved. So ketogenic diet is not one form of diet, it's a range of dietary strategies aimed at reducing the intake as carbohydrates and glucose, but maintaining the nutrition, right? With hemp seed, I mean, you've all tried the hemp seed out there, I hope. I can say without a fear of contradiction that hemp seed is probably nature's most balanced and nutritionally dense food available, right? From a therapeutic nutritional point of view, nothing really compares to the hemp seed, because not only does it have ample quantities of omega-3 and 6 in the right balance, but it has abundant qualities of vitamin E, which protects that oil from rancidity, and huge, you can look at the analysis yourself, huge quantities of B group vitamins and a suite of minerals, especially magnesium, zinc and manganese, which helps the body actually utilise the omega-3. From our point of view, it's ideal because it has zero carbohydrate. So we can actually create foods from the hemp seed which are entirely nutritional but have zero carbohydrate content, so it opens the way for producing a practical and beneficial ketogenic diet. Now, I've been practicing, I suppose, non-conventional cannabis-based medicine for the last 2 years at a clinic in Newcastle, but in the first 18 months or longer of the practice, most of the people that came to us with cancer especially were at their end stages. They'd already gone and seen the docs. They'd had either surgery or chemo and radiation, or usually a combination of all of those things. They'd been subject to 3 monthly CAT scans. Now remember, the background radiation in this world, we get about 1 millisievert of background radiation per year. One CAT scan will give you 10 times that. If you have 4 CAT scans a year, and often it's a lot more than that, you're getting 40 times, like your whole lifetime's exposure in 1 year on top of your lifetime's exposure, right? And it's very much like throwing kerosene on a fire and hoping it'll go out, right? The doctors know from the study of biology that radiation is carcinogenic, right? They know that one CAT scan, especially a whole body CAT scan, produces at least 10 millisieverts of radiation. But the practice doesn't change. We want to see where the cancer's up to. We'll irradiate it. It really becomes a counterproductive exercise, and that's the situation we're in at the moment. And the patients are then involved in what I call a meat grinder sort of process. You'll go to the doctor, you'll have your operation, you'll have your x-rays, you'll have your deep therapy. The cancer will occur in 9 months. They'll offer you either a stronger drug, and my attitude to that, if they're offering you a stronger drug because they think it'll work, why didn't you get it the first time? But it's just that they go through a series of equally ineffective drugs which damage your immune system, and after a year or 2 of this, they'll look at you and declare you unfixable, and then you'll get a referral to the palliative care, and that's the end of the whole process. I don't know if I spoke last time about, everyone is familiar with the placebo effect. A placebo is a Latin word meaning I help. So if a well-intended individual will give someone a tablet, regardless of what its content is, but with the intention of actually helping someone, 20 to 30% of the people will respond in a significantly positive way. That's called the placebo effect, I help. The opposite of the placebo effect is the nocebo effect, which in Latin is I harm. And the same scale of effect is seen negatively. Mum or dad goes into the doctor and says, oh yeah, you've got this, you've had this, I'll give you 3 months to live. Right? That sort of negative energy, firstly it's based on no significant understanding of the biology, and it's based on the issue of the patients they've seen before. That's the patients that stay in hospital. Has anyone been in hospital recently? What's the quality of the hospital food? Right? It's unbelievable how poor it is. I've had professors of neurology argue with me in front of a patient that the diet that sick children eat has no impact on their disease. Just let that sink in. These are highly paid, overpaid professors of medicine telling a parent that the diet that they give their children will have no impact on their well-being. It is frightening to hear that sort of thing, especially when they encourage lollies and chocolates and all this basically coloured sugar and rubbish going down. The nocebo effect is getting more and more. The oncologists in this country are now using what I call frankly bullying tactics to force people along the path of their treatment. They'll give them figures that they have no idea are true or not. You know, you've got 6 weeks to live if you don't have cancer. And now what I'm seeing is a frightening development following the American model, where if a parent or carer elects to use natural non-chemotherapeutic and non-X-ray modalities on their child, the doctors are now dragging those people into ethics committees, and the ethics committees then, if they so deem it, can take the parent to court and have that parent's control of the child replaced by a court order forcing chemotherapy. And we've seen that in Queensland, and at the moment we're going through this nightmare in West Australia with a 6-year-old boy with a tumour called a medulloblastoma. Now there's a lot of nasty tumours, but medulloblastoma is up there with the very worst of them. It's a tumour of children, although adults can have it too, that involves the posterior part of the brain, or the cerebellum. Worse than that, it very rapidly spreads down into the spinal cord. So once it's out and about, it's a very difficult tumour to control. This little boy had a primary, he presented with headache and vomiting, as the way a lot of them do. Firstly, he was missed by 3 doctors at 2 hospitals, and the mother, Dr. Googling, took it to a bigger hospital and said, my kid's got a brain tumour, even though these other 2 said it was normal. The diagnostic quality out there is getting worse and worse too. I'm finding the average well-informed carer has a deeper knowledge of the disease than most of the doctors treating it, but that's another matter. Okay, so this little boy had his primary excision, and then Dr. Walwyn is his name, Tom, actually approached the parents and said, look, we've got this St. Jude's protocol to treat medulloblastoma, and we're going to give, this is how he puts it, we are going to give Ocean, the little boy's name, radiation and chemotherapy. And the mother was aghast and said, but what sort of results can I expect? I'm not exaggerating. This is the results from the St. Jude's protocol. Half the kids won't survive. Half the kids. All of the survivors will end up with an IQ reduction to between 70 and 80 IQ points. Right? That's barely functional. The radiation and the chemotherapy on an infant's brain is catastrophic. A lot of the survivors of leukemia, we're now seeing them. See, they trumpet the advances that they've made in the survival of childhood leukemia. But when you see these survivors 4 or 5 years later, they're generally stunted in size. Sometimes they're like 50% less of what their expected height is. They're having constant seizures, and they're unable to actually attend a normal school and learn in the normal way. And that's what they're actually calling their successes. This mother has challenged the ethics committee at this stage. Now, this is the way it goes. We started our protocol with Ocean, although we haven't fully adapted it. There's some uptake problems, but we've started it basically, and a period now of 8 weeks have gone. And the deal we did with the ethics committee was that let us have control of this child for the next few months. We'll do what we're doing. Take your MRI, not the CAT scan, the MRI, and if we're holding the situation stable, get out of our way and let us continue. That's exactly what happened. What's that?
Naked bike ride. Naked bike ride.
What's that?
Naked bike ride.
Oh, right. Okay.
Just for you.
All the voiders, we want 5-minute recess while we go.
So 5-minute show.
We've got to, I support pedal power. Most people probably aren't aware. A human being on a push bike is the second most efficient biological transformation of energy. I think only a trout swimming upstream uses energy more efficiently. So push bikes have got a lot to recommend them. They're one of the triumphs of technology in all their simplicity. But then I think clothes are too, so I don't know where that fits in. Okay, coming back to Ocean. We did the MRI, and the predictions of the oncologist was that if we don't do anything in the next 6 weeks, he'll become completely unsalvageable. The tumour will race away and everything will be lost. That's why he was seeking a court order to enforce treatment against the wishes of the parents. We had the MRI, we'd held the situation stable. He expressed his surprise, but still insisted that they apply the St Jude's protocol to this child. Right? The deal was, if we're holding him, we hold him. If we're falling behind, we pass him on. We're holding him, but they still want the child. It's like some satanic cult that seems to want to destroy these children rather than demonstrate that we can actually have some measure of control over this disease. Now, at this stage, I won't claim, we're not getting 100% successes by no means, but I said earlier, most of the patients that we've been treating up until now have been multiply treated. They've usually had several sessions of chemotherapy and a couple at least sessions of radiotherapy. And this produces not only a very damaged immune system, and you've got to understand how profound the damage to the immune system is, because you can wipe out the immune system's memory. But the immune system has these memory cells that hang around for decades. But if you start poisoning them, you lose your immune memory and you become much more reduced in your ability to actually resist disease. What can I say here? I don't know how it's going to end up in Perth, but we're certainly going to make a fist of it with Ocean. Okay. What is the ketogenic diet? And hang on, let me just organise my thoughts here. Yeah, now what I was saying earlier is that up until now, our experience has been with multiply treated patients. And we've undoubtedly slowed up the progression of the disease using diet and cannabis therapy. But miracles are few and far between. We still see the odd miracle. But it's more little miracles in terms of doctor said I'd be dead in 3 months and a year later or 2 years later they're doing well. We had an interesting experience. We're treating a young child at Bear Cottage in Manly. Bear Cottage is a child's hospice, and the government generally allocates 3 weeks at a hospice for children with lethal diseases, and the doctors generally admit them to Bear Cottage for the last 3 weeks of their life. Anyway, I was called by the mother of one of these children that had been put in Bear Cottage for her final 3 weeks with the brain cancer, and we started cannabis treatment. Within days, her mood picked up. It was largely because we reduced the morphine the doctors were giving her, but her mood picked up, and then she woke up, and then she started to function as a normal child. And 5 months later, she's still sitting in Bear Cottage doing colouring in books and playing, basically. It's a mark of the character of the doctors that they were overtly hostile towards us, right? Instead of asking what we were doing and, wow, isn't it wonderful, child still alive 5 months later when we expected her to be dead, there was hostility, right? So that really shows you what's going on there. We're dealing with a group of ideologues. They're not true scientists, right? They talk constantly, and especially the AMA, or the Australian Medical Association, talk constantly about wanting to do science. And we can't have medical cannabis because no one's done the science. But no one's done the science on the chemo drugs either. Or the people that have done the science have been ignored. The effects are overwhelmingly negative and overwhelmingly ignored. Remember what I said, there's been no significant change in longevity over the last 30 years, despite a massive amount of money that's gone into it. So we're dealing with a real problem. Now, what's actually causing cancer? Everyone without knowing the cause of a disease, how can we actually address it? Because the only real and valuable treatment for cancer is prevention. And I know that's a cliche, but it's a valuable cliche. The only way to beat cancer is understand what's causing it and take steps to avoid it. Right? Treatment of established cancer is very much a second line of defence. Have they come back to their second round, have they? Okay. Oh. The way I'd like you to envisage cancer is as a balance between protective effects and provoking effects, right? It's common to say, oh, the cigarette smoking caused Dad's cancer. And to a point, that's true, but it's not a useful way of looking at it. There's never a single causation for any particular sort of cancer. What you imagine is almost like a balance. On one side of the balance, keeping you healthy, is all the things you should do. The healthy mental attitude, the clean water, the fresh air, the deep breathing, the rich food, all these sorts of things. Avoid the damage to your body and make your immune system work in the optimal way. On the other hand is the things that provoke cancer. Cigarette smoking is certainly in there. It has a very major effect. But all the negative effects of carcinogens are mediated via oxidative stress, right? It used to be said that cancer thrived in an acid environment and you had to alkalinize the body. I'm sure you've all heard of those terms, and it's a useful sort of concept, but unfortunately it's biochemically inaccurate to a long degree. What I say to people is this: there is no value in trying to alkalinize your body. The body is designed to run at neutral pH. A pH of 7.4. If you doubt me, just consider, have you seen anyone with an anxiety attack that's hyperventilating? When you hyperventilate, you breathe out carbon dioxide because you're over-breathing, and as the carbon dioxide leaves your lungs, it's carbonic acid in your body. The effect is that your body becomes alkaline. And I've measured this many times on blood pH measuring. If you hyperventilate, your body becomes alkaline to 7.5 or even 7.6. But that tiny movement away from neutrality, the body's completely paralysed. The muscles don't work, the nerves don't work, and the person simply locks up. So there's no practical reason we should try and alkalinize our body. So what does it all mean? And has everyone that said that wrong? The issue is no, they're not wrong. They've got the wrong explanation, but the right behaviours. Now, if you substitute oxidative stress instead of being alkaline, you work well. And the foods that are said to be alkaline are antioxidant. Right? Now, I got onto this back in the 70s when I first studied natural medicine. I studied that before I did allopathic medicine. I remember talking to one of the lecturers, and he was giving me the spiel about alkaline foods. I said, hang on, big boy. I said, what about lemons? I mean, you know, going back to my grandmother's grandmother, she said they're the healthiest things around, and they're acidic. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, oh, Andrew, he says, yeah, they're acidic, but they have an alkaline residue. And I said, well, that's clever, but what does it mean? And so it sort of sowed the seeds of doubt in my mind that that theory was wrong. So if you substitute the concept, the body, by its very nature, just the fact that we're a biological organism, we're a bit like a campfire, right? You throw fuel in and you get heat out, and if you put an engine on it, you can do work. That's basically what we are. We're a slow-burning room body temperature engine that converts food into work and growth and things like that. Now, in the normal process of metabolism, you can't avoid the generation of what they call oxygen-free radicals. The concept is it's a bit like sparks coming off a fireplace. You know, they come off, and if you don't quench those little sparks, they'll start fires elsewhere where you don't want them, okay? In the same way that a campfire throws out sparks and they have to be quenched, the body throws out these oxygen-free radicals and they have to be quenched, or those oxygen-free radicals impact on all different parts of your cellular machinery, surprise, surprise, including the mitochondria, which probably established the first lesion in the cancer process. So the oxygen-free radicals damage the mitochondria. When mitochondria don't work properly, you start to see the generation of the nuclear changes. So whereas the doctors are saying all the nuclear changes are the primary lesion in cancer, what Otto Warburg discovered and proved, as far as I'm concerned, the first lesion is in the mitochondria, and the mitochondrial changes then cause the nuclear changes. So there's no point in trying to fix it downstream. You've got to fix it where the problem starts. And that's the whole basis of approaching health as a balance between provoking factors and protective factors. Okay, it's not that hard. Now, what are the provoking factors? Certainly the benzpyrenes in cigarette smoke is a clear carcinogen. But what are other carcinogens? Alcohol is listed medically as a class 1 carcinogen, right? Fluoride, if we were going to do it properly, is a class 1 carcinogen. If you look, and at times previously here, I've actually shown some maps of North and South Island, and these are very freely available on the internet. North and South Island, the North I think is unfluoridated and the South fluoridated. The cancer incidence is dramatically demonstrated to be higher in fluoridated countries, right? It's not so much that it alone causes the cancer, but it reduces the threshold. It adds to the overall level of oxidative stress and poisons every enzyme protective system in your body, right? It's one of the additives. Now, on the other side, remember we're dealing with a balance. Here, we've got cigarette smoke, we've got too much alcohol, we've got chemically added foods. Remember, a study was done in the United States now about 10 years ago where they measured cord blood, umbilical cord blood in newborn infants. Wait for this, they looked at 200 children from country and from rural and urban settings. They all had industrial chemicals detected in their cord blood. That means they're born already contaminated. 100% of the children had detectable levels of DDT, even though it was banned 30 years before. They all had detectable levels of Teflon. So be careful with those non-stick fry pans. They all had bisphenol A, right? Just to make it horrible, the average number of industrial chemicals in newborns exceeded 100 different industrial chemicals detected in the cord blood. That must apply a major metabolic stress on these children. And I've said it before, and unfortunately it's probably coming to pass, that this current generation, older adult generation, may be the last one to actually live longer than its parents. Right? That's a fairly sobering thought, but we're actually creating a state of sickness such that what's been at this stage a gradual improvement in health and longevity is now starting to pass. Right? It's not a very attractive thought considering the process which is initiated is still going on. We are still selling plastic, or not selling, still giving plastic bags away in supermarkets. Right? Is everyone aware of the Central Pacific Gyre? Yeah, the Central Pacific Gyre is a continent-sized mass of rotting plastic in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The man who discovered it, I think Silverstein, spent 15 years trying to get the word out that this terrible thing was happening. It now turns out there's 5 of these massive gyre in the various oceans. They're now starting to degenerate. The seafood, the fish are actually eating the plastic, and the chemicals, the bisphenol A and the other chemicals in the plastic, are having a very adverse effect on the marine life. Fukushima, right? When was the last time anyone read an article about Fukushima in the newspapers or heard about it on the news? What we're looking at in the eastern coast of Japan is the world's largest nuclear disaster ever. Right? I'll say that again. Fukushima, the proper name for it. It's the world's largest nuclear disaster. You think of the saturation coverage that Chernobyl got. Right? The nasty Russians were contaminating the world. What Chernobyl was a chemical explosion in a nuclear facility. So there was a one-off release of nuclear materials as the thing just blew up. In Fukushima, we have, for the first time in the world, a triple meltdown. Are you all aware of this? I just have to say it because no one else is saying it. A meltdown is this. A normal reactor vessel has something like 6 inches of steel and then 6 foot of concrete. That's just a containment vessel. At Fukushima, the uncontrolled nuclear fire that's going on is through the steel, it's through the concrete, and now it's in the ground. It's eating away at the soil. When it gets down to the water level, no one can actually predict what's going to go on. It'll certainly lead to massive contamination of the aquifers, but there's also the possibility it'll explode in some ways. And there's 3 of those going on. At this stage, the only way they're keeping it under wraps is by pumping 300 tonnes of seawater into it each day and just letting it run away. So they're basically using the sea to keep this uncontrolled nuclear fire going, and just let's not talk about it. I'm told that in Japan it's now hard to get Geiger counters because they don't want people to actually measure what's going on. The problem with radiation too is that it's hard to actually measure what its real dose is. So say for instance, one little speck of dust containing a plutonium atom, one atom of plutonium, blows away down on the wind and we breathe it in, you will probably get a lung cancer from that, but it won't show up on your Geiger counter. That's the hot particle theory. So even Geiger counters don't give you a good sort of protective effect against these things. And the only way forward in today's world, and I've given talks before about staying healthy in an unhealthy world, and that's what we've got. We've got an unhealthy world that's becoming more and more unhealthy. My primary message, if we can possibly do it, is to get active and take steps to make it less unhealthy. Right? There's no point in just watching the world fall apart and reaping the consequences of that. That means more and more sick kids, more and more autistic kids. When was the last time you heard a credible explanation from any doctor as to why something like between 5 and 10% of the kids are showing symptoms of autism? Right? When have they even guessed at what is causing the autism? Why are they looking for genetic causes of autism when it's happening within one generation? Autism is a form of brain inflammation caused by a whole range of chemical insults. There's not one cause. We'll have some questions in a minute. I'm nearly finished the talk. Hey? Yeah, we can't. It's a full body disease. That's what it is. It's an ecological disease. We humans are designed to live not in isolation, but in an ecosystem. I mean, we have to accept we're biological beings and we operate under biological laws. Monsanto chemists in factories can't replace health. You can't create an elemental diet that'll keep people healthy. You may be able to keep them alive, but you can't actually keep them healthy. So coming back to this, remember what I said, you've got a balance between these things that are making you sick and there's some things you can't avoid. At this stage, we can't avoid EM radiation. People will ask, do mobile phones cause cancer? Do radio towers cause cancer? There's fairly clear evidence that television transmission, because of the strength of the signal, if you're a child living for a certain number of years within a certain number of kilometres of a TV antenna, your risk of leukemia is much higher. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I don't encourage anyone to look for isolated reasons of disease. What you've got to look for is the overall balance. Am I doing enough in my lifestyle? Am I spending enough time looking after my body, just as you look after your car? I mean, you take your car in every 6 months to have oil changed and filters fixed, you know, tyres balanced and things like that. When do you do it with your own body? I mean, the yoga practices, the Tai Chi, they're the balancing things. Yeah, the oil changes, the dietary things. everyone should have some sort of time devoted to their wellness. They might have 1 or 2 days during the week where they eat a much more restricted and modest diet. You might take up periodic fasting. There's a lot of specific things you can do to actually improve your resistance to disease. And the way I see it, the next sort of, I don't know, the next few years, the next decade are going to be critical. The people that don't guard their immunity and don't look after their health, we're already at the cusp of an epidemic of diseases. We're certainly at the cusp of an epidemic of cancer diseases and all these other inflammatory things like autism that we don't fully understand. You don't need to understand a disease to resist it, right? Your body, have some confidence in your body, look after your body, right? Why have I spent 20 years trying to push hemp seed onto the population? Firstly, we're the only country in the world, us and New Zealand, the only 2 countries in the world that haven't got legal hemp seed for human food at the moment. Unfortunately, the New South Wales government currently opposes the application to have hemp seed as a human food, although we're informed that the movement is probably in place and we'll get some law change next year. At that stage, we hope to manufacture a series of foods, especially child-friendly foods like ice cream, non-dairy ice cream made from hemp seeds, that we can actually start pushing on the population. And I have very little doubt that if we have a massive uptake of hemp seed foods that replaces our current poisonous dairy supply and a lot of the other sort of artificial foods, we'll have a measurable improvement in human health within a decade. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We see patients' lives turned around with just 6 months of application. If we could do that at the population level, we can actually change the direction, the trajectory of where we're going, because we're on a downward trajectory. Our forests, our rivers, our health, everything is on a downward trajectory. Our morality is too, because we now know these things. We have access to the internet, we see what's going on, yet we haven't been able to break through the apathy and actually take the sort of steps that are necessary to actually address the problems with the degree of seriousness that they should be addressed. All right. Now, will we do some questions now? Now, who was first? This lady here in the front was first. Huh?
No, I wasn't. It was the light showing in my eye.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Should people come up here to the mic if they can? Travel with it. On the concept of it, but still they go. Stop the puzzle. Sorry,
Okay. Yep. Just with regards to treatment of brain cancers, how would you do it therapeutically, and does the blood-brain barrier have an effect on your treatment? And what sort of dosages of tinctures and seed or whatever you would recommend?
That's a huge question, because there's not one form of brain cancer. What we do when we receive someone who's been treated, firstly we get a fairly comprehensive history of where they're up to, because it can modify your treatments, and you try and make a decision as to whether you're going to go really hard on this one and try and contain the disease, or you move into palliation. Because like I said earlier, the first patients we were getting were all real end stage. They'd been 3 or 4 times treated. And I'll just fill you in on the way chemo generally works. This is the way most patients that I've seen over the last 10 years. You come in with whatever disease you've got, you have the treatment, you reduce the volume of the disease almost certainly for the first treatment, because you get rid, remember I said there was polyclonal, there's lots of different cells in the cancer, so you get rid of the susceptible ones, but then the cancer regrows and it's semi-resistant. They treat it again, you get rid of the sensitive ones, then it regrows and they're fully resistant. So by the 4th cycle, it's normally hopeless. So the first thing you do with brain cancer, you work out where you're up to. If we get a new untreated one, if there's pressure effects and the surgeons are comfortable with doing a debulking operation, I'd certainly prefer that at this stage. If I had more confidence in our methodology, we might tackle them without surgical debulking. But when there's pressure effects, if there's already headaches and vomiting, you're in an emergency situation then, and we rely on the surgeons. We also rely on the surgeons to reduce the pressure in the brain if there's hydrocephalus. So you've got to make an assessment as to where you're up to physically, right, and anatomically. Say, for instance, we've had a primary excision I'm increasingly moving towards a ketogenic diet, even beyond cannabis therapy in the first instance. Now, my rationale is this, because whilst we've had fairly good results in slowing things down, we only very occasionally get dramatic responses. And sometimes with cannabis treatment, the dramatic responses aren't sustained. So just as a cancer can become resistant to chemotherapeutic drugs, it can become resistant to cannabis used as a drug. Now, this is a really important point because there's different ways of using cannabis. One way is a pharmacological model. It's commonly called the Rich-Simpson method, where you really load someone up on oil to the max in the hope of getting very high levels at the site, and it does cross the blood-brain barrier, there's no doubt about that, and trying to induce apoptosis via a chemical means, by a signalling means. Now, it appears evolving now, and this has been more in prostate than brain cancer, but the fact still shows, when you do a biopsy of the cancer, and it's necessary really to do a biopsy and get a tissue diagnosis, they're starting in a few research labs to look at the cannabinoid receptor density on the tumours. So some tumours have a lot of cannabinoid receptors on them, and we presume they may do well under cannabis therapy, direct pharmacological cannabis therapy. But just as cells mutate to have resistance to chemo, they can mutate to not have any of the receptors, and then they become cannabis unresponsive. So occasionally we'll use a sort of a Rick-Simpson, a high dose regime over 6 weeks in some cases, and this is in negotiation with the people. But more likely now, what I prefer to do is use a low dose cannabis regime that includes CBD as an immune stimulant and normalisation. So you're not trying to get a pharmaceutical action against the cancer, you're trying to upregulate the person's immunity, you're trying to deal with their anxiety, right, and reducing their stress levels, whilst the metabolic therapy, the ketogenic diet, actually has the effect. What we're experimenting with, and remember we're evolving these treatments as well, is spending 3 weeks on a pretty major keto diet, putting the cancer under metabolic stress, and then deploying a pulse of cannabis therapy. So there's a lot of experiments we're yet to do, but at this stage my preferred approach with the brain cancer is moderate cannabis and a ketogenic diet, right? And using escalating the cannabis if we're falling behind as a sort of a last ditch attempt. But with high with high THC, especially in elderly people with no recreational cannabis experience, the Rick-Simpson method can be quite arduous. Right? I've had a lot of people get, not a lot, but enough people get into significant trouble such that they don't want to take that sort of therapy. It will improve as we build up the supply of CBD, but until then, the Rick-Simpson method is a very limited place in the way we practice. Addie.
Can you qualify, Andrew, in regard to pH level? If you're talking about the pH level in the blood and the pH level in the saliva and the urine?
Okay, yeah. Addie's asked a question about pH. Now, a lot of people have been advocating taking sodium bicarbonate as a cancer cure. Right? Now, the theory is based on the fact that if you can alkalinize the body, the cancer can't grow in an alkaline environment. Part of the reason why there's confusion is, remember I said that cancer can only operate without oxygen, so it generates lactic acid, so the local cancer environment is very acidic. But that's different to say what your saliva or your urine is. Right? The saliva is designed to be alkaline anyway, it's an alkaline digestive, so testing the pH of that really doesn't matter very much. Equally with testing the urine, the only important thing is what's going on in the body. And like I said, in health, the body always keeps its pH at 7.4. And I've done literally thousands of pH tests on arterial blood. So there's a difference between the waste products, like the urine, which just reflects how much you're getting rid of. So say, for instance, you take 2 tablespoons of bicarb and you test your urine 4 hours later. It's going to be alkaline because you're excreting alkaline, but there's not going to be any health benefit attached to it. You got that? Because it's not the way to address it. The way you should be addressing it is the oxidative stress issue rather than the pH. Now, having said that, and this is really interesting, there's a group, the man's name's Pedersen, he was an American researcher and he was a real fan of Otto Warburg's. And remember, the cancer can only generate a limited amount of energy and produces a lot of lactic acid. They came up with a molecule called 3-bromopyruvate, which is a very simple molecule, and it appears to actually block the exit of lactic acid from a cancer cell to the outside. So say, for instance, it's building up waste and you put a plug on its waste outlet, suddenly the cancer cell becomes poisoned by its own lactic acid. From what I gather, in the 70s and 80s, they did a few experiments with 3-bromopyruvate in people with end-stage cancer, like massive amounts of cancer. And it was very, very effective. Even so effective, they had what they call a cancer lysis syndrome. So if you're able to actually kill a lot of cancer really suddenly and you release all these toxins into the body, the patient can go through this fairly characteristic system called a tumour lysis syndrome. It's temporary as you get rid of all these things. But what it proved was that this 3-bromopyruvate appears, when coupled with metabolic therapy, uniquely effective in reversing even advanced cancer. The fact that it's probably effective is confirmed to me when it's now been held up in court proceedings for the last 20 years and is simply not available for use. So in the future, I think if we can only get some really honest biochemists to work on it, we can actually exploit the fact that the cancer does live in a microenvironment which is adverse, and we can use those differences between cancer and other things to actually get a real reversal of advanced diseases. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So you're saying that the pH in blood is always stays around 7.4?
4, yeah.
Even if you're having a poor diet?
Yes, yeah, look, even if you're having the body is amazing how it can hang on no matter what you're doing. Right? It'll adjust the breathing and the urine to keep it at 7.4. The only exception to that, say you've got diabetes and it's going right out of control, you get a condition called ketoacidosis, right, with the diabetes, and once your pH gets down to about 7.2, you're in real trouble. Right, but I mean, I've taken lots of bloods from, useless pig slobs that do nothing and just eat McDonald's and stuff. It's 7.4 until they hit the wall, then it falls quickly and they die. But there's not this gradual deterioration. The body maintains itself, then just drops away in the terminal stages.
There must be some credibility then if you're testing the urine and the saliva, and someone's on a poor diet and it's showing to be very acidic. The saliva and urine test.
So Andrew, we got to keep moving a bit.
Okay, I'll talk to you.
And you'll be able to talk to Andrew afterwards outside.
That's okay.
Thanks very much for your time today. Very interesting. 4 years ago, we treated my mother with. Can you hear me? We treated her with cannabis for liver cancer. That was 4 years ago. She's very well. But the question, and we're flying in the dark. We didn't know what we were doing. But now we have my brother-in-law here with pancreatic cancer. The question that I'm most interested in is dosage. And so first thing about dosage, and is the oil, like the tar that you get in the syringe, better than the cannabis butter that you can make? Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, I really...
These are questions that I unfortunately can't answer with any certainty, but they're really important questions, right? The first one, they talked about dose. I already touched on that. There's different scales of using the cannabis, right? In some instances, and this makes it harder for the people that don't have high cannabinoid receptors on their tumours, if someone takes the oil and gets better, they're like a beacon, so why doesn't everyone do it? But the fact is everyone doesn't have that responsiveness to their cancer, right? I'm trying to encourage the North Shore Hospital to start doing cannabinoid density measurements on their biopsies. But given that it took us 25 years to even get medical cannabis on the agenda, I'll probably be a very, very old man before they start doing that. We'll see. Things can change.
I've noticed using like a multi-combustion type setup with hash, that it also can work as a marker. You can actually use cannabis as a marker to find a high expression of cannabinoid receptors in the body. If you take lots of it, you'll notice you get dark, where the lesions are, they're darker. So you can actually use cannabis as the marker. You don't need a special radioactive ligand to do anything. You just use cannabis, and it will mark cancer or any autoimmune disease or all fall out and kill it off.
Now, it might be chaotic in these, but we're going to have some order.
Yeah.
Lots of people talking.
Please talk in the mic.
And also, Andrew will hang around all day. He's here all day. So people will be able to talk to the mic. So we've got to keep moving a bit.
So please talk in the mic. One question per person.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Look, I've got a disease called, autoimmune disease called ulcerative colitis, and I'm dealing with it with a pretty powerful immune suppressant. I've also got Hep C, and I'm just wondering if I could treat it with cannabis oil rather than an immune suppressant.
The question is a very good one. He's got ulcerative colitis, and the question is, can you use cannabis rather than an immune suppressant? An immune suppressant for that is really a foolish method of dealing with things. Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis have been trialled in Israel, and again, they only took the worst cases and they got stunning results. Right? Something like half these intractable cases went into full remission and stayed there with CBD cannabis therapy. After what we're doing at the moment, because we actually introduced cannabis therapeutics in intractable epilepsy, in the way we make the oil in the sonicator, leaves the buds about 50% extracted, soaked in olive oil. We're going to now run an ulcerative colitis Crohn's trial where we'll gather in 20 patients and run a trial and use that as a lever to have these inflammatory bowel diseases included in the list of cannabis responsive conditions. But the indications are at least half the patients will respond dramatically. Yeah.
Another question here.
Sorry, I'll just reiterate the question. The question was, is there a difference between having the actual oil or having the butter and other differences in the
Yeah, again, it's a really good... The question is, do different methods of preparation and extraction affect the medical efficacy of the extraction of what you're doing? Probably, right? But without having detailed analytical equipment, it's really hard to give a definitive answer. Luckily, or no, unluckily, the state government has gone to great lengths to prohibit us from having access to analytical equipment. For instance, Sydney Uni was quite prepared to do our analysis, so we can take, say, get a fingerprint on the herb, get a fingerprint on a solvent extracted from the same herb, and get a fingerprint from, say, an infusion extracted. And then we can look at the differential extraction. I mean, the issue of minor ingredients like THCV and all these other minor ingredients are getting more and more prominence. We don't know at this stage which method preferentially extracts the most actives. But in the next few weeks, we're actually getting access to an HPLC laboratory, and probably by next year I'll be able to give you a definitive answer to that question, but not this year. All right, because you can't guess it. What I've found from empirical work with the children, say for instance with intractable epilepsy, they seem to respond better to an unheated infused product than a solvent extracted heated product. That's my impression. You can still get an effect, but the better effect seems to be the unheated infusions. But until we've actually analysed what we're giving them compared to what the original herb was, I can't answer your question definitely, but there's almost certainly a major effect in the preparation.
Does that have anything to do with the body eating the plant?
With the which?
With your body eating the plant when you consume it.
Can I? Yeah.
Your body's eating the plant when you eat it.
Hang on.
You can't even hear it with your body.
Andrew, we've got another question from this
You need
gentleman.
the microphone.
Andrew, just an extension of what you're saying, there's lots of different ways of extracting. Some people do butane, alcohol extraction, but it seems to be the easiest way to extract is just take the flower and soak it in some oil and, chop it up and put it into some medicine. What do you think of that?
Well, that's the infusion method. That's how we started with the epileptic children. I mean, I used a sonicator for two reasons. Firstly, to make it look a little more scientific for the television cameras, and because but you can do it in a glass jar. I mean, a quick medicine can be made just by getting olive oil or MCT oil in a jar in a dark cupboard and just shaking it every few hours for a day and then straining it. That's a good medicine. But don't waste the leftover flowers because it's only about a 50% efficient extraction. Where's the man with ulcerative colitis? What we're wanting to do after we've made the children's epileptic medicine is use the leftovers to make the Crohn's disease medicine. Right, so that's where we're heading. We're just waiting for our crop to come in now, and that's going to be our next project. Right? So a lot of things are in the wings now. It's a really, really exciting time to be in cannabis therapeutics, especially as the volume of cannabis we're getting access to is building up. Luckily, too, people are getting a little braver. And if I've achieved anything in this life, is to actually make even a dozen or 2 dozen people braver than what they were before. Because the only thing it takes to get rid of a prohibition is courage. Right? You stand, it's like a nightmare. Seriously. Yeah. Hey? Yeah.
Andrew, I've got a lady who's got a...
I'd just like your opinion. I have secondary metastatic breast cancer, and I've read that there's a difference between the Rick-Simpson method and FECO, is that correct? FECO method, and the 1-to-1 ratio for the oil. I just wanted your opinion.
Okay. You're talking about 1-to-1 for CBD and THC? Okay. Big question, right? That's a big question. At this stage, I mean, you know, they keep talking about the need for trials. I agree. We actually do need scientific trials, but we don't need them in the way they're doing them. Now, how you measure the effect against cancer using different ratios is either done with tissue culture, where you grow the cells in a petri dish, or it's done with animals, where you either get an animal that's prone to cancer, or you actually implant cancer into the animal, right? And then you treat them in different ways. Depending on who does the experiment, how you set it up, there's a case for arguing, at least in brain cancer, that a 50-50 mix works better than either one alone, right? It's not absolute, because there's a lot of different models, but having a decent amount of CBD in the mix makes the higher doses of THC much more tolerable and probably more therapeutic. So where I have a choice, if I'm treating a cancer of any form, I like to go for something like a 50-50, right? As much for its tolerability, but probably also, and also remember the CBD has a lot more neuroprotective effects, antioxidant effects than the THC. So yeah, I know it's not popular amongst a lot of the hardcore smokers, but CBD does have a major therapeutic potential.
Andrew,
On one hand, I've read that THC is better for breast cancer, but because mine's metastatic, I've read CBD is better for that side. So one-on-one ratio has got to...
Look, that's what you have to do. I mean, that's what we've done. You have to actually play probabilities, right? I mean, in the future, if we had 100 ladies that we treated with 2 different things, we'd get some impression of where it's up to, but they're simply not wanting to do it. I'll just take a minute, Sis, before we go to the next question. The issue of trials. You know, the Chief Health Officer, Kerry Chant, and all the rest are raving about doing controlled trials. They're talking about these things, remember, double-blinded, randomised crossover trials. You know about those? Right? In many ways, they're a way of actually hiding the truth rather than revealing it. In conditions that we're dealing with, that are like cancer, like inflammatory bowel disease, like epilepsy, what we should have when you're approaching cannabis therapeutics is what you call a prospective trial. That means anyone who volunteers to have the medicine is given it, and you just see how they do. You don't need to give a placebo to a kid that's having 20 fits a day to see which one's more effective. The parents know it in 3 days. So I'm a great supporter in trials, and we can't get answers without trials, but not the trials that the doctors want to do. They're more designed to obfuscate the truth than to actually show it. But in the meantime, if you've got access to 50-50, that's where I'd go. But I'd also use metabolic therapy much more, and I'll talk to you about that.
Andrew, I'd like to just thank everybody for their questions. This gentleman has the last question, and then we're going to have a short break, and you'll be able to talk to Andrew during the break. Okay, so here's our last question.
Thank you, Andrew. I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and I don't know the best way to attack it, whether by oral or suppository, to get really to the...
All right. So the question is mode of administration. I'll just quickly go through the different types of administration and the relative strength and weaknesses. First thing with oral administration, firstly, everything I said about just cannabis therapy versus metabolic therapy still applies. So cannabis isn't the be-all and end-all of the cancer treatment, right? You can titrate the amount of cannabis you take to act against the symptoms that you're having, but in terms of controlling the cancer, you'll be one of those I should talk to outside because there's a little bit of a rave associated with it. But the general part of the question pertains, and that is what's the best way to take cannabis? It really is horses for courses, and there's not a definitive answer on that, right? There's a few points you have to observe. One is that orally ingested cannabis has a very low bioavailability, so you probably absorb less than 10% of what you actually ingest. And when you take it orally, and it goes through your stomach and then through your liver, oral cannabis, and this is why edibles are generally a little more dangerous to take than smoking and other forms of administration, because the liver 11 hydroxylates the THC, and it becomes much more psychotropic. It can have a latency of about 2 or 3 hours, so you can eat a biscuit, say, and everything's going well, and then suddenly you're severely psychotropically affected and sort of wish the world would just stop spinning or something like that. That's because of the liver effect, and that's the rationale for using suppositories. Right? The rationale is most of the gut drains through the liver, and therefore the cannabis can be 11 hydroxylated and made more psychotropic. With suppositories, because it just goes through the rectal mucosa, it bypasses the liver, and in some ways it's analogous to smoking. Right? The issue though is there's only a narrow area in the rectal plexus where it doesn't go through the liver, and if the substance goes too far up, then it goes through the liver just as if you'd eaten it. Right? If you're dealing with symptoms, vaporising is 2 to 3 times more effective in getting the cannabinoids into your system than eating them. Right? 2 to 3 times more effective. So a well-administered vaporiser can absorb 20 or 30% of the cannabinoids, where oral is less than 10%. The alternative to using suppositories, and that's got its own little issues and things, is to use buccal absorption, where you either use a spray as a tincture or you just put the drop of oil in your mouth and you hold it in the mouth so it's absorbed buccally. Right? In certain children during seizures, we've even tried topical administration when it's mixed with MCT oil, and it's certainly absorbed that way, and we've got a clinical effect from topical administration. For you, it depends, because there's a dichotomy between symptom control and reversing the cancer. Like the oil by itself will hold the cancer. This is what I've found. Only about 1 in 15 of the patients actually dramatically respond to even high doses of cannabis with a reduction in the size of the tumour. We've seen it in liver cancer, we've seen it in brain cancer. It will often have an effect of slowing the progression of the disease. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It appears to interfere with the generation of new blood vessels, and it also increases what they call intracellular adhesion molecules, which makes your good cells tighten up and leave no room for metastases to get in. So there's different degrees of effect. But when you say stage 4, and that word's often used erroneously by people, to mean very, very severe, stage 4 is technically cancer on 2 sides of the diaphragm. Right? So, you can die just as well with stage 2. It's not a term that's well understood. But with pancreatic cancer, I really feel it has to be metabolic, and I'll talk to you about that. And the cannabis should be used for symptom control. So there's 2 different ways, like I said, of using cannabis in the hope of a direct pharmacological action against the cancer, where you occasionally get a response, and even if you do, over a period of a year or 2, we've seen relapses. So, for instance, we've treated people with high dose of Rick Simpson oil, and the lung metastases disappeared, and we were dancing around, mate, we're famous, look what we've done. But 12 months later, there was a shower of metastases, now cannabis resistant, in the bone. Okay, so the cancer is an evolving enemy, and that's the advantage of the metabolics. It doesn't seem to be able to develop resistance to metabolic therapy because its lesion is a metabolic lesion. So it can't cure itself of its initial metabolic problem because that's what made it cancer, right? So that's why you don't rely on the cannabis. It's an important adjunct in the treatment, but it's only occasionally curative. Yeah.
So don't move. Don't move. So Andrew's going to hang around all day. I've just got to keep moving it because we've got a few speakers.